Okay, welcome back. I'm Candace Savonin. I'm your main instructor for this course. Let's talk about troubleshooting GitHub Actions. This is the licensing information for this course. In this chapter, we're going to demonstrate how to troubleshoot broken GitHub Actions. We're going to try to recognize and resolve the most common ways that GitHub Actions break. So, a well-designed GitHub Action test will successfully fail. And that sounds like a paradox, but it's not. Successfully fail, which means it will alert you to when there is a problem. If things are not working, we don't want it to act like things are working. We want it to fail and be like, hey, this is broken, okay? But alternatively, we want it to successfully pass. So if the software is working fine, it ran fine, we don't want it to fail. We want it to be an indicator of whether our changes that happened to our code are, working or not, right? We want it to be a good test, right? So this means you need to beware that sometimes we have silent errors, right? So when you are first making your GitHub action, I highly recommend do not just look for the green check mark. Don't let the green check mark fool you. You need to look into the logs to see if it's actually working as you suspect. So when you add or change an action, in any way, make sure you go back to the logs and look into each step to make sure that it's working as you expect. Okay? So let's go over some tips for some troubleshooting actions scenarios, okay? First of all, we already talked about look out for silent errors. Second of all, kind of already talked about this too, look at the logs closely. It can be intimidating to look through the logs, especially if there's a lot of them, which there often are, but you'll get to know about how to identify the important pieces for you to troubleshoot something, okay? You're going to need to go into the actual drop-down menus, look at the code, use the search function. You can search for different terms. So like, for example, if you see something that at the very end it's complaining about a package not being installed, search for the name of that package. You might find that further up in the logs, which might have taken you forever to find if you were just manually looking for it, if you search for that, you might find where it's actually failing in that installation. It might tell you that there's actually, oh, look, there's another dependency that it can't seem to install. And maybe what you need to do is add a dependency in there or what have you. So use the search function, look into those logs very carefully, and try to kind of take the useful pieces of what you think is happening and look on Stack Overflow, Google them, see if other people have had a similar error. And that will help you kind of find some ideas. All right. The other thing I'd recommend to you is when you are developing a GitHub action, it's really handy for you to use the workflow dispatch or pull request triggers for development. Why are these handy is that the pull request trigger will run whenever changes happen on a particular branch, and it will run the GitHub action you have on that branch. So let's say you're developing a new GitHub action. If you have it on the branch, it's just going to rerun it every time you have it on there. So even if your end result, end product for your GitHub action isn't going to be pull request initiated, it can be handy when you're developing to have it be pull request initiated. Another way you can do it is by workflow dispatch. That, remember, is the manual button where you go in and press the button so it will run. So the other way you could do it is have it that way. And on workflow dispatch, you can choose which branch. So you could run the version of that pull request, the version of that GitHub action that is on a different branch, on your development branch, for example. So those are two very handy things. But one small caveat, if you are using GitHub action variables, remember that some of them differ a little bit, okay? So if you're building a whole thing based on what the GitHub action variable outcome is in the pull request version, remember that if you change the trigger, you might also change the variable that's outputted for those default GitHub action variables, okay? That's just a quick note, so that could trip you up. All right, print out things to test your assumptions. Echo is your friend. If you are not sure what's happening, or say there's a variable but it's not really doing what you're suspecting, just make a new step that prints out stuff so you can kind of see what it's printing out and see if maybe your assumptions about what is being printed out is actually not quite right. So print out things liberally. You might want to delete those before you actually merge the thing, but for actually development, that can be really helpful. If you are borrowing a marketplace action, 3 things I want to say for troubleshooting those. One is read the docs carefully, okay? Just like any software, you want to make sure that you're using it as the developers intended. If the documentation is not super great or up to date, you might want to consider seeing if there's another action that does kind of a similar thing that's been maintained more, or maybe you write it yourself. But that's only, I would not go to that first. Try to see if you can get your action to work properly based on the documentation by looking at it carefully. Sometimes the problem could just be you need to update to a newer version of the GitHub action from the marketplace. So keep an eye on that. Sometimes if there's errors printed out that you know are not from your code and you're confused about where they're coming from, take a look at their releases and see if they have a newer release for that GitHub action you're using, and that actually might solve some problems. But you're going to need to test that first to see. All right. So also remember that if you have like startup issues, let's say you create a new GitHub action and it doesn't even run, it says it's like a failure to start up. There's 3 things in particular you're going to want to look out for. One, it could be that an essential specification is missing, right? Maybe you didn't write on. Maybe you didn't write jobs. You didn't tell it something that it really, really needs. Maybe you didn't put what computing environment, right? And with runs on. So you're going to look especially into that. Also, you're going to look into syntax issues, right? Did you put colons where you needed colons? Did you put curly brackets where you needed curly brackets? Look into all those things. And usually it'll tell you a line, but keep in mind that sometimes when it tells you line 11, you might need to look at like line 10 or line 9. It might be right before that you have a syntax issue. Lastly, spacing. I know we started off talking in an earlier chapter about YAML files being particular with spacing because that's how it determines what the subsets are. So just look very carefully into that. I'd highly recommend when you're developing your GitHub actions, try to have it so your text editor has space characters. There's usually an option in all kinds of text editors. Have it be so it'll have your blank, your characters. So spaces, indents, it'll show you exactly what they are. All right. So those are some good tips for troubleshooting. And in this exercise, in this chapter, there's going to be 3 broken GitHub actions that we're going to have you try to go through, run them, try to find out what's wrong with them. So keep these as your hints. Okay. You're going to want to keep these hints handy. They're also in the reading, so you'll be able to reference them there as well. Good luck!